Welcome back to The Shed. Tonight I want to take a look at the 1987 Nebula award-winning novel in Pat Murphy's The Falling Woman. So what I like to do with these reviews is provide a bit of a plot overview, talk to what I liked, what I didn't like, put some of these novels to the memory test, and we'll rank it on our sci-fi shed ladder that we've got going on here, where I aim to rank all the Hugo and Nebula award-winning novels. But this is a very interesting novel, right? Because Wikipedia refers to it as a psychological fantasy novel. So what I would like to do, in addition to everything I've mentioned, is really have a look at what the fantasy genre is about and see if we can categorize this truly as a fantasy novel, because I've got some questions. But anyway, hopefully you can help me clear some of the confusion I have about this particular novel. So the story is written in a first-person point of view, and it alternates between Elizabeth Butler, who's this world-renowned archaeologist and author, and she happens to be working on this archaeological dig, a field study into Mayan civilization in South America. The other one is written in a point of view of her estranged daughter, in a lady called Diane. And Diane has been going through a bit of a rough patch. She just lost her father and also had a bit of an affair with a co-worker that's not gone quite well. So she's finding herself a bit lost and decided that unannounced she's going to go and pay her mother a visit and try to reconcile their relationship. So what we find is that, Diane comes unannounced on this site, and they try to learn a little bit about each other. And Diane is sort of puzzled by her mother's behavior. She's a bit of a strange woman, this Elizabeth, and is sort of linked to a suicide attempt that she had as a younger person. So she's about 50 years old, is Elizabeth, Diane's mother, and during her early marriage she had a bit of a rough patch there, and the only way she thought she could escape that situation is to try to attempt suicide. So because of that, she has sort of a weird ability where she can, I'm not going to say because that might be a spoiler, which is something I want to talk to when we try to categorize this novel as a fantasy novel or not. But let's just say, for the point of clarity, that she has this uncanny ability to be able to look at artifacts and really paint a picture of what civilizations may have looked like and the people living in those worlds may have looked like. And we'll leave it at that for the plot overview. So a very simple plot, right? It's basically these two estranged mother and daughter people written in a first-person narrative on this field trip, an archaeological field study, trying to make a reconciliation and ultimately deal with some surprises. And I'll leave the surprises at that. So look, I found it a very enjoyable read, right? But I really struggled classifying this as a fantasy novel. So I really struggled classifying this novel as a fantasy novel. And in order for me to sort of understand why is it that I'm struggling so much, I've put down a couple of bullet points as to what I feel fantasy novels normally entail. Now, I'm not a huge fantasy reader, but I have read a fair bit of fantasy over the years. So I've put down a couple of bullet points as to why I think that this book doesn't really quite fit the genre. But I'd love to hear from you if you've read the book, or if you feel that some of these points, or you want to add to these points, or you feel like I haven't quite hit the nail on the head. I'd love to hear your comments below. But I'm going to rattle through them and try to explain why I struggled classifying this novel as a fantasy novel. The first one is the use of magic or magical forces. There is no use of magic in this novel at all. There was nothing magical that couldn't yield any special ability or special powers. So I sort of struggled in that aspect. There was no talk of magic at all in this novel. So I got a big cross on the list for me. The other one is world building. Now, I thought she did an absolutely beautiful piece of writing describing. It's a very immersive book, and I'll talk to that in some of my likes section. But it's a wonderful piece of writing, but there's no real world building here, right? We're not talking about magical worlds or alternate universes. There's no science fiction or fantasy element when it comes to the world that she built here. She's really done a wonderful job of describing what a Mayan, field study, archaeological dig would look like, right? And I will give her full credit for that, but I couldn't see any real strong fantasy world building in this, so it got another big cross for that for me. fantastical characters. Now, I put a bit of a question mark with this one around fantastical characters, because when you read a novel, you've really got to ask yourself, is this just something that Elizabeth is seeing in her head, or is this fact? Are these things really happening? And I'm not going to talk to that because there will be spoilers in that. So, I encourage you to read the book to see why I've got a question mark on there. But it's actually not even a question mark. It's actually a big cross, right? I don't think there are fantastical characters in this novel at all. The other one is A Dangerous Quest. And again, I've got a question mark followed by a cross next to that. Because without giving spoilers away, you can go one way or the other with this, right? But there are a couple of bits in the novel that for me suggested an alternate path. And I sort of challenged whether or not there was a dangerous quest in this novel at all. The other one is mythical creatures. So that was, again, another big cross with a bit of a question mark on the tail end of it. Because, again, you've got to ask yourself when you're reading this book, is this really happening? Or is this something that is happening within a troubled person's mind? So I'm going to leave it at that. But for me, I had a big cross followed by a bit of a question mark around mythical creatures. Animals or things with human characteristics. Again, there was a big cross in there for me. There was no animals or or things that are human characteristics like we've seen in some of the novels we've reviewed here on the channel in the past, right? These are all human characters, all very believable and wonderfully written human characters, but there were not things or animals, acting as humans, right? So again, that was a big cross for me. The other one is real people in fantasy places. And again, there was no talk of that. These are fictitious characters in a fictitious scene. It's not like, for example, when we read To Your Scattered Bodies Go, where we had these real, historical figures in a fantastical science fiction setting, right? So there's none of that at all. So these are just, fictional characters in a fictional setting that is very well illustrated. And the other thing that I will leave for you to really determine as to whether or not this novel really fits the genre category, as I've categorized it, is supernatural occurrences. So I have my doubts, I have my question marks, but I'll leave that for you to read to see whether or not you agree or disagree with me. But it didn't take away from my enjoyment of the novel, right? So talking about the things that I liked, I thought this was a wonderfully immersive piece of writing. Like, you could literally see what the author intended us to see on a mind dig. You really did get the sense of, hey, yeah, I can really envision this, right? I can really see what life would be like on an archaeological dig. I particularly like the market scenes. I could just almost smell and hear the chaos that you would see in one of these, South American marketplaces, right? It was just a beautiful, it's probably one of the most immersive books that I've read when it comes to setting. I also really enjoyed that first person narrative. It was really nice to see both Diane's and Elizabeth's point of view in the alternating back and forth each chapter. I thought the pacing was really nice, and I thought the writing was really wonderful. I thoroughly enjoyed Pat Murphy's writing. Highly recommended, just purely on the writing and that first person narrative. So one of the things I really didn't enjoy in the novel is the main character is 53 years old, but she continuously refers to herself as an old woman. Like, even doing the most basic sort of exercise seems to be some strenuous activity that an old woman should never try or attempt, right? And I just thought, just so ridiculous. This person should be in the prime of her life, but she continuously considers herself over the hill and incapable of doing all these things, and this is not a setting that an old woman should be in, right? I just found that really crazy. I started to think it's really strange because she was 33 years old, or at least around mid-30s when she wrote this novel, and I just didn't quite understand as someone in their 30s could think that 50 is over the hill and you're past your prime date. So I just found that so unrealistic, so unacceptable in many ways, that I thought to myself, this person just has no idea of what life would be like at 50, has made no attempt to actually talk to someone who may be in their 50s to see what kind of vigor and strength and passion they may have for life, and just written this story that seems to suggest that if you're over 50, you're done, right? There's no real place left for you on this planet. And or the other part of me was thinking, oh, she's just very unfit, right? This is a very unfit 33-year-old to think that in 10 years or 15 years time, she's just going to be over the hill. So I just thought, no, yeah, there's something quite amiss here. I just didn't really understand how someone who's in their 50s, instead of being in the prime of their life, is considered over the hill and gone. So I don't know, maybe that's just my age speaking here, but I just didn't really like that part of the novel. And look, and the other part for me, and which may affect it when we look at Sci-Fi Shed Ladder here, is I really couldn't see a whole lot of fantasy elements or science fiction elements, which is a big criteria in what I look for in these books. So look, overall, I still really enjoyed this novel for what it is. And what I would classify this novel as is just a good piece of fiction, right? I just couldn't really see the science fiction or the fantasy in this novel, but it didn't take away from my enjoyment. I really did enjoy it back to back. Really thoroughly enjoyable read, highly recommend it. But who would I recommend it to then, right? I would be hard pressed to recommend this to any science fiction or fantasy reader. I just don't think it'll appeal to a lot of what people who like science fiction or fantasy really levitate towards, right? So I don't think I can recommend this to any fantasy or science fiction reader. Can I recommend it as a good general piece of fiction? 100%. You won't be disappointed, right? But come in with eyes wide open and understanding that this is going to push the boundaries of what you feel fantasy is. At least it did for me. But still a very enjoyable read. When it comes to the memory test, look, yeah, it was just, what could I recall? Not much apart from, yeah, it's a really good piece of literature. I really enjoyed the writing. I remember I enjoyed the writing, and it was sort of set in this Mayan civilization point of view, but that's really all I could remember. And I must have read this early 2000s the first time I read it. So this time around, I was sort of expecting to see some Mayan sort of civilization archaeological dig, and it didn't disappoint. I didn't really remember the characters. I really did not remember the concept at all, and I struggled putting the concept into words, as you probably have noticed, but it's still a rather enjoyable read. Hey, I want to set up a Sci-Fi Shed Ladder, having said all of that, and seeing exactly where this one ranks on our ladder. So back to the Shed Ladder and ranking tonight's 1987 Nebula award-winning novel in Pat Murphy's The Falling Woman. So look, a very enjoyable and interesting read, but one of the criteria that I look at when we're doing the Sci-Fi Shed Ladder here is just how strong is a science fiction or fantasy theme. So I've just spent a little bit of time trying to explain where I think this novel falls short. So it's going to be interesting where it falls on our ranking system here. So just a quick recap from ascending to descending order, from A side to B side, from left to right. We got June down to Red Shirts, through to Flowers for Algernon, down to the 5th season. And where are we going to rank tonight's wonderful novel? And that's the thing, it's a really wonderful novel, but should have won a Nebula when we're talking about science fiction and fantasy. And for me, look, I think there is still enough of a fantasy element in there to justify its place on the ladder. Many will probably disagree with that, and there will be many that would agree that yes, this is definitely a fantasy novel. I'm conflicted, right? I am still conflicted, but I'm not going to pretend I know more than the professionals who do this for a living. So I'm going to say, yeah, it is a wonderful novel in itself and worthy of a Nebula award-winning novel. So it deserves a place on our SF Shed Ladder. But it's going to be on the A side or on the B side. So some of the input I look for is how strong is a fantasy theme? Well, I'm going to say it's probably the weakest of all the books we've read to date. So it's got to be right down towards the bottom when it comes to fantasy themes. The other criteria I look at here is how strong are the characters? The characters were okay, right? The characters were quite strong. I didn't think they were very well developed or overly complicated, nor do I think it's sort of, there was that reconciliation of, you know, relationships. I don't think it went as far as it could have gone to make what is a good book a great book. So I thought the characters were okay though. The other bit I look at is the world building, just general good writing, and my overall enjoyment. So I've got to say, it's not going to make the A side because of those themes, right? It's just not a strong fantasy theme. But is that fantasy theme stronger than it is in the 5th season? And I would have to say, no, it isn't. As much as I didn't like the 5th season, it was 100% a fantasy novel. Wonderful story there about those people who could move tectonic plates and Earth in general and have an impact. Very magical themes, right? And it was a wonderful piece of world building as well. I mentioned in that review. If you haven't seen it, link down below. But it was a good piece of world building and had strong fantasy themes. So is The Falling Woman going to be better than the 5th season? And I've been debating this all week in my head. And I'd have to say that's just one of the criteria, right? So I would have to say, as a fantasy concept, no, I thought the 5th season was better. But there was very little else I liked about the 5th season. I just hated those characters. And I made mention that in my review. I just didn't care for the characters. I didn't care for the writing and Jemisin's writing. I just did not like the writing at all. So my overall enjoyment, I still say that The Falling Woman is better for me than the 5th season. It's a much, much better written novel. It's a wonderfully written novel. So it's going to be better than the 5th season. Is it better than the Einstein intersection? And is it going to be better than the Quantum Rose? And I'm going to say no, right? I'm going to say The Falling Woman sits just above the 5th season. Of that weighting, how strong are the science fiction themes or how strong are the fantasy themes, are very, very, very strong. They are definitely stronger in the 5th season, but the writing, the characters, the plot, everything else, I just did not care for at all. So that's where we're sitting tonight, just second last from the bottom, which again is just one of those novels that just defy this ladder system, right? Because it's just a wonderful and highly recommended novel. It was pleasure throughout. I really enjoyed reading it. It was very immersive, like I said, a wonderful piece of literature. You know, it's a great book, but these are all great books. I say that all the time, and that's where we're going to sit today. Hey, I hope you enjoyed that, and I'll see you next time in the shed.